Ma'am, thank you, ma'am, for putting such very insights of the topic, subject, history, how to improve it through understanding the historiography and historical method with the new teaching and learning methods as pedagogy. Thank you, ma'am, for giving us very key ideas and key knowledge to improve the university subject history and India's history. With this, now we'll have break, no? We keynote? Yeah. Now we begin with the our main speaker today's inaugural. Yes, ma'am. I invite, shall we have? Yes, ma'am? Shall we have? Come here. Now I invite Saidulu to give a brief introduction of our today's keynote speaker, Professor Karuna Madams. I invite Saidulu, who is a research scholar from University of Göttingen, Germany, who is also former Osmanian. He studied from Nizam College, graduation, PG, and PG from Central University, no? Central University. So I invite Saidulu to give the brief introduction of today's keynote addressee, Professor Karuna ma'am.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you once again for coming to the international conference titled on the emerging trends in historical research and pedagogy and a translational perspective. And I would like to give you a brief introduction about the speaker as a keynote speaker. The keynote speaker name is Dr. Karuna, and she has done PhD from University of Delhi, and then followed by she has done a postdoc at University of Oxford. Okay. Now she is currently an assistant professor at Azim Premji University, Bangalore, and her mainly focus on the labor history, especially the informal sector. So I don't want to take much time over here because we are running out of the time for the lunch. I understand. So in short, I would like to invite Dr. Karuna to address the students. Thank you so much.
Hello everybody, good morning, good afternoon. And thank you, Saidulu, for the very warm welcome. And I would like to thank the organizers, Professor Indra, Professor Lavanya, and the History Department of Osmania University for this invitation. I'm greatly honored and privileged to be here. I would also like to thank the Vice Chancellor, who had to leave because of his busy schedule, our honorary guest, Nawab Najaf Ali Khan, and Professor Sudharani, who just spoke before me and said a lot of things, which I think you're going to hear again. So thank you very much. I asked when I was invited to give this speech, I asked who is going to be my audience. Sorry, I also want to thank the most honorable guests, speakers and participants of the conference here who are actually way more equipped to be keynote speakers and are way more senior to me. So in some ways, I also feel awkward, but I'm very honored by this opportunity. So when I asked, who's the audience, what would you like to would like me to speak about. I was told that the audience would be largely students apart from the conference participants. So what I'm going to say today might seem very ordinary and run-of-the-mill to the honored participants of the conference. So please forgive me. This is mainly addressed to the young students and younger researchers who are starting their journey of discovery in history. So, I teach at Azim Premji University, largely teach undergraduate students. And now we don't so much have interviews for admissions, but till very recently we had lots of interviews for admissions. And so in our admission interview, we usually kind of ask our students, why are you interested in history? Why do you want to do it? What will you do afterwards? Why are you not studying, some technical subject where, you think you'll get a job? Why are you not doing engineering? And so on and so forth. What interests you in history? And often we get, what is the use of history? Why should we study history? So then often the answer that we get is, we can learn from history. We can learn from the good things we did, the past mistakes we made, etc. So when you push them further, say, but give me an example. What would you really learn? Do you think we can really learn from history? Then after some thinking, often we get answers of, like the Harappan civilization, the drainage system, we can learn from that. But we don't seem to have learned for 2,000 years if we look at our cities or our villages, right? So, are we really learning from history? Or they say, the Arthashastra or the way Akbar, ran his administration, we can learn administration. Then we say, but then aren't we a very different society now? Aren't we we are not feudal anymore. We have voting rights. What would we do with, administrative skills from that period? Then again, we get a slightly blank answer. So then what is the use of history, right? A question that apparently a young boy once asked his father, and this young boy who was asking the question was asking his father, who was Mark Bloch, a very well-known annals school historian, which our previous speaker has already mentioned. So he was asking, and Mark Bloch then later on went on to write a book called The Historian's Craft. I would encourage every student in this audience to please go and read that book. And the circumstances in which this book was written also tells us a lot, because the book was written during the Second World War when Mark Bloch, who had also fought in the First World War and was already a very, very well-established historian, was in the trenches in the French resistance against Nazi Germany. And he wrote this book in bits and pieces during the French resistance. He could not complete the book because he was executed when the Nazis caught him. So, his friend and collaborator, Lucien Febvre, whose name was also mentioned, then went on to publish the book. So it's an unfinished book, but a very worthwhile read. Though it was published in the 1950s, it still says a lot for all of us as historians. So I would like to quote something that he says there. He says, history, so his primary answer to what is the use of history, right, is not that, you learn from past mistakes or thing, but it is to understand the present through the past, to attempt and explain how we got here. So to quote him, he says, we are historical beings. All of us, humans, are historical beings in the sense that we understand ourselves in terms of the stories and narratives we tell about ourselves. We understand ourselves in the present in terms of the ways that we have constructed and interpreted the steps of human action and meaning that led us to this point. So the key values of history include the intellectual interest we take in understanding the past and the meanings we create for ourselves by discovering and interpreting aspects of our history. So he goes on to say that, what happened in the past, you cannot go back and change. A battle lost, a fire that destroyed something, you cannot, or a civilization that died, you cannot go back and change it, right? But the knowledge of the past, how we talk about the past, how we construct meaning about the past, how we interpret the past, is something that is constantly changing. right? As the discipline transforms and, as new methodologies emerge, as new questions are asked, the way we understand the past, the meaning that we make out of it, and by that, the understanding that we create about who we are, that constantly keeps changing. And that is where the history plays a role and the historian plays a role. So you can never go back. So the historian's craft keeps updating itself with ever new methods. In the time of Bloch, Lefebvre, and others, they were pioneering new methods, identifying new sources. Till then, nobody had looked at, parish records, looked at landscape, looked at electricity records. So in his book, he talks about, records of the electricity company. He says, yes, those should also be looked at. Whereas in those days, what were primarily looked at were, official state records, right? So the powerful, right? So this great power of history to shape the understanding of who we are has always been recognized by the powerful, right? The powerful have always known the importance of history, and they continue to do so. That is why we have battles over history. That is why there is a constant need to control the narrative of history, right? History was mostly written by the powerful to legitimize and justify their power. However, history does not and should not belong only to the powerful, right? And generations of historians, as already pointed out by the previous speaker, have worked to unearth buried histories and articulate alternative stories, right? So not very long ago, the European discovery of America was proudly declared as the beginning of history in those continents, right? Before that, no history existed on those continents. America was believed to have been born through the tireless efforts of men who believed in freedom and justice. So this is the founding story of, America. This official version has been challenged by historians, especially Black and indigenous ones, uncovering the erasures in that version of history, documenting the stories of genocide and slavery that went into building this apparently free America, as well as, but not just documenting destruction and genocide, but also documenting the hard work, the hard labor, the creative work of women, of Black Americans, of indigenous people, of workers, of activists that went into building the society that America is, right? So we often forget the hard work that goes on behind the scenes, right? War and destruction is very apparent, but the hard work that goes on day by day inside households, in neighborhoods, that goes into building the next generation, in building new society, often is not hidden. And the hard work that historians have done is to bring that to light as well. And I'm sure, this is a story of the history of US, and we can see now how right now this, the version. So in US, the words Black history are being banned, gender is being banned, right? So this attempt over decades of historians and others to push back against these singular powerful narratives is now again facing its own pushback. And I'm sure we can recognize similar patterns across the world, right? It's not just happening in America. Before diving into a discussion on the historical method and the importance of archives, I would like to dwell a little bit on what another great historian said about the relevance of history. So the person I would like to refer to is Gerda Lerner, who, again, very interesting to see how she came to be a historian, right? And the kind of history that she wrote. Gerda Lerner was Jewish and fled Austria when the Germans invaded, fled to the US, worked for many decades as an activist in different roles, did different things before entering academia. But after entering academia at a later stage in her life, she was a pioneer in setting up what today we call as women's studies departments and women's history. So here is what she says about why history is important. All human beings are practicing historians. As we go through life, we present ourselves to others through our life story. As we grow and mature, we change that story through different interpretations and different emphasis. We stress different events as having been decisive at different times in our life history. And as we do so, we give those events new meanings. People do not think of this as doing history. They engaged in it, though they engage in it often without any special awareness. We live our lives, we tell our stories. It is as natural as breathing. Our self-representation, the way we define who we are, also takes the shape of the life story we tell. What we remember, what we stress as significant, and what we omit of our past defines our present. And since the boundaries of our self-definition also delimit our hopes and aspirations, this personal history affects our future. So how we see ourselves, both personally and as a collectives, affects what kind of future do we dream of, right? So there is a very clear connection between the past, the present, and the future. For humans, having a history is important for having a sense of self, both for individuals as well as collectives. It is as important as having a livelihood. But then, since everyone participates in society and history from different locations and vantage points, the histories they make and narrate cannot be a single story, right? Your story will be different from my story, even if, we participated in the same events of history. So, is it possible to have multiple stories, or is there only one version of the story? Are plural narratives possible? I guess it is, and there should be plural narratives, though the powerful in society often want to control the narrative. So the challenge is, as historians, how do we make space for plural narratives? Various groups and communities, in order to make space for themselves in the world, need to recover and articulate their histories, their role in building the world we now occupy. Histories that were thought to be non-existent, unimportant, or dangerous, and therefore silenced. Thus, it isn't surprising that women's history came into being in the wake of the women's movement, or that black history was pioneered by those who were part of the anti-racist struggles, or that the question of caste in history has emerged since the 1990s and 2000s alongside anti-caste movements. Till C.L.R. James wrote the history of the Haitian Revolution, the history of revolutions was European. What revolutions do you know? You know the American Revolution, you know the French Revolution, you know the Russian Revolution. How many of us know the Haitian Revolution, which was one of the earliest revolutions, right? Haiti was the first country to gain its own independence from colonialism, to overthrow slavery, to abolish slavery. But how many of us know that history? And it took a black historian, Trinidadian historian, C.L.R. James, to tell that story, not just to say, okay, we need to include this story as well, but to interrogate the larger narrative about revolutions, and that revolutions only happen in the West. And also to confront the narrative that, the abolition of slavery was something because of the benevolence of white abolitionists, right? But the struggle that slaves and ex-slaves put into the overthrow of slavery then questioned that dominant narrative. Thus, the historian's craft is one which is always a conversation of the present with the past. Questions arise in the present. Movements, changes in contemporary society give rise to new questions and new interventions. And this brings me to the question of the historical method or the historian's craft, for which I again turn to Bloch. So it's very interesting that Bloch calls what we do as historians as a craft. So a craft is not something that you also learn just theoretically, right? A craft is something that you learn by doing, and already there was talk about how we need to shift our pedagogies to learning by doing. So, but how does a historian do history, right? So the historical method, even though Ranke's view of history, which is the positivist view of history, that, history is just there and the only thing you need to do is line it up and tell it the way it is, no longer holds sway in academia. However, things have not changed so much at the level of the school or even college history. In college and school textbooks, we still teach history as though it is one story and as though it is a given. And we are all tested in MCQs about the correct narratives of history. In such assumptions of history, the sources are expected to speak for themselves, with the historians playing a passive role. In a century and more of history writing, since the time when positivist history school held sway, numerous historians have demonstrated the fallacy of such assumptions, showing the active role played by historians in choosing which pieces of evidence to use, how to connect them, and build a narrative, what kind of narrative to construct, and so on. Indeed, if anything, the understanding of what the historian's craft is has swung to the other extreme of the pendulum, with arguments being made that it lacks any objectivity, that you cannot be objective in history. It is as subjective as, say, writing a novel. It's not very different from fictional writing. Personally, I feel it is important to be aware of our subjectivity while striving to keep the rigor of the craft by laying it open to be assessed, interrogated, and critiqued by fellow historians, right? So I think it is important to recognize who we are, where we stand, our role, our subjectivity, however, without the loss of at least, trying to maintain the rigor and subjecting our own arguments, our own evidence to the critical analysis of others. So something that Mark Bloch says is that, sources only tell you something if you ask them something, right? So Professor Korisetta is here, and I'm sure the moment he enters a landscape, right, to him, so many stones, landscape features immediately speak. They won't speak to you and me because we don't know what question to ask them, right? And because of his practice, because of his experience, he has the right questions that can be asked, right? So what you get out of a source entirely depends on the questions you ask it. Till then, the source is mute. Often students worry that a certain set of sources have been used by someone else. Oh, what will I do? This subject has already been studied. This archive, everybody has already seen. Will I get any new archive, right? These are often questions that bother young researchers. However, two different people can look at the same set of sources and see totally different things. Forget about then, what argument they make out of it. That is even the next step. But what do you see, right? And what do you not see? I'll just give you a very small example from my own research. So I worked on handloom weavers in the Madras Presidency, and as you know, textile history is, one of the more researched fields because of the different East India companies and the records and all of that. So I was looking at records which many historians before me had also looked at, right? However, I found something strange there which I did not expect, and then I was wondering what to make of. I found lots, so usually, I know more about the Tamil districts of the Madras Presidency. So the well-known weaving communities are the Saurashtra, the Kaikolar, the Saliyar, and the Devangar. So you expect to find them in the archives. Now, besides all of these, I found many, hundreds and thousands of Parayar weavers, right? But so all the secondary literature that I had read had hardly noted them. And if they had noted it in passing, saying, yeah, there are some part-time Parayar weavers, and they moved on, right? But for me, this became a very big question. Who are these weavers? Now, what do I do with this information? So you can choose to ignore it, but then if you choose to see it, it's not enough just, okay, I can count, in different districts how many Parayar weavers, and I can say, okay, there were this many Parayar weavers. That's just giving you some data. But do I stop there? How does this information fit into the existing story? History is like making a puzzle, fitting a puzzle together. You have different pieces that you're fitting together. So you have this now new piece which was not there. Where do I fit it? What story do I tell? How does it fit into the existing narrative, or how does it question or challenge the existing narrative, right? So apart from saying, okay, there were pariah weavers, and later on, somehow in the 20th century, they disappear. So then having to explain why do they disappear, the larger question that a historian should ask, and that is where interpretation and argument come into play, is that now, how does this help me ask a question about the role of caste in, specifically in handloom weaving, but more generally in economic organization, in historical changes, and so on. And so that pushed me not only to document pariah weavers and their disappearance, but ask a question of how caste operated. And then go on to do a comparison of the Saurashtra weavers and the Kai-collar weavers and the pariah weavers, and what role did caste play in kind of shaping their different futures, right? And it operated differently. It didn't operate the same way for Saurashtra weavers as it operated for the pariah weavers, right? So here is some scattered information that you see in the archive. Many people have seen it, but actually haven't seen it, right? You see it, right? And it attracts your attention. Then what do you do with it? Do you just present it, or do you go further to use that as a vantage point to ask new questions and try to answer them in new ways? Just to give you another example, cookbooks. Cookbooks, I think some 50 years ago, people would have thrown, if you are clearing up a house or clearing up something, clearing up a library, and you need to create more space, cookbooks would have been the first thing to go into the bin, right? What use are cookbooks, right? But cookbooks are such valuable archival material, right? Again, you can use cookbooks to ask many different questions. If you want to ask a question about recipes, you will get an answer about recipes. If you want a question about asking about, what kind of ingredients were used, say, in the 1920s when this cookbook was being used, you will get an answer about that. If you want to ask a question about caste, you will get answers about caste. But unless you ask that question, you will not get that question. Who wrote this book? Which community was eating this food, right? And that question was not asked 40 years ago. You can ask a question about gender. Again, the language in which it is written, the language, often cookbooks were accompanied by, how a good housewife should behave, how she should wash the vegetables, and so on. So if you are asking questions about, how the household was organized, what role did gender play, then you will get those answers from the very same cookbook, right? So a cookbook can give you different answers depending on the kind of questions you ask. So being grounded and curious is very important. And connected to this is the ability to be surprised by the archive and rethink our own assumptions, right? So often we already have, it's okay to start with a hypothesis. All scientists start with hypothesis, right? It's okay to go into the archive having a rough idea of what you want to do and what you think happened, right? But the danger is when we want everything to fit into what we already think. The importance is to be all right to be surprised by the archive. Oh, this is not something I expected. Now, what do I do with this information? How do I fit it into the larger picture, right? So again, I would quote from Gerda Lerner, a meaningful connection to the past demands above all active engagement. It demands imagination and empathy so that we can fathom worlds unlike our own, contexts far from those we know, ways of thinking and feeling that are alien to us. We must enter past worlds with curiosity and with respect. When we do this, the rewards are considerable. And here again, I feel, we should enter the archive with humility and not with this, that because we have, the power of the written word, that we know how to interpret what was there in the 19th century. That there are other ways of knowing out there in the world, which we have to work with, which we don't have, right? But we need to work with people who have those other kinds of knowledge. I'll give you just one example. I hope I'm not taking too much time, but I'll give you another example. This was narrated by the archaeologist Selva Kumar when he came to our university for a talk. And he said they were looking at some cave paintings somewhere in Tamil Nadu in the Salem district. And, they were making assumptions about what these things represented. Oh, this must be some ritual. This must be this, that, and the other. When they started interacting with the communities that live there now, right? Many hundreds of years later. And, they were talking to them about their livelihoods, their practices, and so on. And then we're also asking them, what are these? What do you think these drawings are? And immediately one of them pointed to something and said, oh, this is, how, this is the rope that you climb to reach the beehive. These communities, they extract. So immediately they had an insight, which because of their knowledge and their knowledge system and their living experience, threw a totally different light on what these big professors were assuming, right? So it is important to not look down upon these other kinds of knowledges. So if you are doing research on handloom weavers or on leather workers, it is important to spend time to respect and to learn from the knowledge systems that they possess, right? The other thing that Mark Bloch says is cross-examination is the prime necessity of well-conducted historical research. Documents speak only when they are questioned. The light of evidence must converge from sources of many different kinds, right? So it's very important to ask cross-questions. The next task, which I've already touched upon, of the historian is to build a narrative, to construct an argument, not only interrogating the sources to establish authenticity, but then using them to provide new perspectives. So here I would like to take an example from the large and ever increasing feminist scholarship, right? So feminist scholarship or feminist perspectives on history did not just drop down from the sky one day. They emerged from the women's movement, right? From people in the women's movement saying, but where is our history? And here I want to link back to what I said in the beginning. All of us as individuals, as collectives, need history to determine who we are, right? So the women's movement also needed history to say who they were, who we are, right? And that's how they started. So many of the early feminist historians came not from the hallowed halls of academia, but from the women's movement. And same goes to, whether it is black historians or anti-caste historians, right? The job that feminist historians did was not just, okay, 50% of the world are women, and so what were women doing in different parts of the different time periods of history? We need to document that. Yes, very important job, but that is not sufficient, that is not enough, right? Feminist historiography not only documented what women were doing in history, but interrogated mainstream narratives of history through the lens of gender. So take any golden age, whether it is Renaissance period, or ancient India, or any period, there will be a golden age in the dominant narratives, right? What feminist historians asked was it a golden age for women? Golden age for somebody does not mean golden age for everybody, right? So the feminist historians asked the question, but golden age for whom, right? So Professor Uma Chakravarti's book, Whatever Happened to the Vedic Dasi, right, is an important question as to, these dominant narratives, right? Similarly, feminist historians not just documenting women who participated in the national movement. Yes, very important. However, what role does gender play in constructing the idea of a nation, in constructing the idea of, of nationalism, right? Which is a very masculine idea, right? And the role that, gender played in the construction of these identities. Why do we have a Bharat Mata, right? How did Bharat Mata become the symbol of nationalism? And what kind of Bharat Mata? Is it a, silk sari clad with lot of jewelry, upper caste looking Bharat Mata, or are there other kinds of Bharat Mata as well? So who represents the nation, right? So this is where a gendered lens, so this is not just add and stir kind of history, but it is using your vantage point, using the particular lens to ask new questions and challenge existing narratives. So I will leave it at that. We can discuss more if students have questions later on. But I would like to move on to another important and very connected issue, which is that of the archives. So all historians need archives, right? And I've already said that, what are archives needs to be redefined. Usually archives are in locked, state departments, and the narratives, the documents of the state are the biggest archive that we have access to, right? Now, it's a big challenge because those don't record voices of people on the margins. So what do we do to tease out, the voices of the people on the margins? One is, of course, to interrogate those sources critically, right? But the other is also to build alternative archives, right? And that is a very, very, and especially in today's world, where, especially in our country, where we don't seem to value, old things. We all throw them to the kabadiwala. We just need to go to any library to find, how everything is disintegrating. So it is a matter of urgency to collect, new materials, to collect oral narratives, to collect them and to preserve them for the future, right? So, and it is not, it is also, and we also need to recognize that this is also an act of power. What do you choose to keep? What do you choose to throw away? Itself, in many ways, determines what histories can be written and what histories cannot be written, right? So here again, I would like to go to, it's there on YouTube, you can watch this film by Professor Uma Chakravarti called, I think it's called A Quiet Little Entry, which, is an exploration of the history of an ordinary housewife, a Brahmin housewife married to a salt inspector, right? And that narrative is built from a few scraps of evidence that were found in her trunk. One was a library card. The other was, the receipt for a donation paid to the Indian National Congress. Something else was a small, the red booklet of Mao. All sorts of little, and some personal letter. So using these scraps of material, the history of not just this woman, but of a wider history of women who otherwise have not been seen as participating in the national movement was constructed, right? So often we look at stuff in our lofts and in our trunks and we think, oh, this is all rubbish, throw it away, right? So as historians, you really need to guard against that. What can become archives? Matchbox covers, oral histories, songs, even pieces of cloth. I was talking about different kinds of knowledge systems, right? Textile swatches, I work on textile history. So bits of textiles, right, are very, very valuable sources. But the way I will look at a piece of textile and what questions I am capable of asking and the answers I'm capable of getting are very different from the questions that a weaver will ask of the same piece of cloth, right? I've had this experience of going with a weaver to, to a British museum archive and us, interpreting and drawing very different kinds of information from those pieces of cloth, right? So that leads me to the other question. Okay, we will collect everything and we will keep everything, but the question becomes archives for whom? For what? Right? To tell whose stories. So today the digitization is a craze. You want to digitize everything. And why do we want to digitize everything? Because we want, as historians, we don't want to go sit in a dusty archives and work. We want to, at home, sitting with the AC to get all the information that we want to get. So all this digitizing is for whom? For the already the privileged researcher? What happens to the people whose histories those are? Do they have access to it? So recently I have been involved in the digitization of Handloom Weavers Union material. So the question becomes, once that is digitized and once it is put away in a library, who has access to that? Is that being digitized for me and for other researchers probably sitting abroad? What happens to the people whose history it was? Do they have access to it? Can they make their own stories about it? Can they also have a conversation with the researchers who are writing it to, say, what are you writing about us? Can we be part of the conversation? And here I would like to point to yet another archive. So many of these new archives are being created, often by people who are in the midst of struggle and not for the purposes of research. You look at the Bhopal Gas Tragedy Museum. Why is it important that there is a Bhopal Gas Tragedy Museum? It is established by the survivors of the Bhopal Gas Tragedy who already have huge struggles just to survive, but they feel that it is important to document that history and to tell their own story, right? So their effort is not for researchers, it is for for their own community and for telling the world their version of the story, right? Coming back to so the other archive I wanted to point out was the Kamra archive, which is a queer archive based in the National Law Institute in Bangalore. It is not a digital archive. They have consciously decided not to make it a digital archive. Why? Because it contains very sensitive material of people who were involved in the queer movement, especially in the lead up to the challenge to the Section 377. Not very long ago, they were all illegal people, right? And this is all very personal stories of personal information. But it is there. You can go there as a researcher. You can engage with it. But you also engage with the people who run the archive. So you also engage with the people who have created that archive so that you know that history and so that you have a dialogue with that history before telling your own narrative about it, right? So I think it is important to create these dialogues. It is important to think, how do we store these material? What kind of metadata do we create, right? Metadata is something where search words. So what kind of search words do we create? Who is it useful for, right? So these are all important questions that we need to keep in mind when, making archives. So finally, and I will take only a few more minutes, coming to the topic of this conference, which is, global histories and transcending national geographies and national histories, right? So history as a discipline emerged in the age that the world got organized into nation states. So this is an incredible coincidence that history as a discipline, taught in universities. History has been written for a very, very long time, but as a discipline taught in universities in a big disciplinary way emerged alongside the emergence of nation states, right? In the past few centuries. In the colonized part of the world, as in the case of India, history came to be written in the framework of the nation state. So when do we start writing our own histories? Just after independence, right? So the framework that we use is the framework of the nascent new nation state. As Hobsbawm, Anderson, and others have shown us, constructing a shared history is important in imagining the nation into being, right? If you read the work of Anderson called Imagined Communities, it shows how nation states are actually very recent in history, right? We like to believe that, or most nation states like to believe that they have an uninterrupted history of 2,000 years, but nation states worldwide are only a few centuries old, right? And these nation states were created through historical processes. And in that creation, history played a very important role because you had to create that sense of belonging. You had to create that collective identity, and to do that, you had to construct a shared past, right? So constructing a shared past was very important part of the nation-building agenda, right? So if you look at all the major thinkers during the anti-colonial struggle, you can look at Nehru, Gandhi, Savarkar, the whole spectrum. You can look at people, Ambedkar, from different ideological, different ideological thinking. You will see that all of them engaged with the past, right? Because at that point of creating a national identity, thinking about the future, you had to engage with the past. And it's very striking to see how their visions of the past were so starkly different. And this is something we do our students. It's all, we were talking about pedagogy and, interactive learning. We ask our students to read excerpts from Ambedkar, from Gandhi, from Savarkar, from Nehru, from all of them. Read, and what did they think about the past? And if you look at Nehru and Gandhi, who did not see eye to eye. Nehru wanted an industrialized India. Gandhi thought that the future lies in the villages, right? However, both of them look at a very nostalgic past, right? Of, some continuous Indian, past, a shared past, right? Whereas, Savarkar in many ways shares that idea also of a continuous past. Whereas people like Ambedkar, Tagore, and Periyar question the existence of such a shared past. When a country is divided, when you cannot even enter somebody else's house in your own village, where is the shared past, right? Was the question that Ambedkar asked. But so what I want to point out is that history in the course of the nation building was very, very central question that all these thinkers raised questions about, right? So the framework that they worked in was a nationalist framework, right? But again, one needs to remind ourselves that nations are only a little more than a couple of centuries old, right? So now, especially since globalization, since the 1980s, 1990s, people have moved away from talking about or focusing exclusively on national histories. Again, questions have come to be asked about global histories. So, but then is global just a postmodern, fancy way of looking at things? What changes if you stop looking at things only from a nationalist framework and you look at it from a global framework? I think globalization or global networks are not something just very recent and modern. They are very, very old. So if you get out of a nationalist framework, then the first global thing that you can look at is the the population of our world. Today, DNA, techniques in DNA analysis show that we all share common ancestry just 70,000 years ago, that we all emerged out of Africa 70,000 years ago. So in a sense, we are all migrants. So, and migration is not something new. Migration has, happened over the centuries. Often the kind of millets we eat, the millets which we see as, ancient millets, ancient knowledge, these millets we share with Africa. Many of the kind of things that we take for granted I'm sure in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, the green chilies are like an essential part of the cuisine. When did they come? A few centuries ago. Where did they come from? Across the seas, right? So whether it is ideas, whether it's the dress we wear, so many central parts of our own identity have crisscrossed the oceans and crisscrossed the mountains, right? Whether it is through the Silk Roads or whether it is through the oceans. So taking a global perspective immediately, changes what you are looking for, changes your analysis of, who belongs, who doesn't belong, who is a migrant, who is not a migrant. All these things become, you are forced to look at them fresh. So a global lens also brings into sharp focus another very pressing issue of our times, namely climate change, right? And I think the COVID was also a very important point to kind of shift our horizons to the global. Recent historiography has suggested that one of the key causes for the decline of the Indus Valley was probably changes in the climate. We now know that different cold and hot waves had significant impacts on the course of human history. The volcanic eruption in the Indonesian islands of Toba, have evidence, and Professor Kori Settar has looked at them here in on the Deccan, right? And future historians will probably study how human-caused global warming affected gig workers and construction workers laboring in the increasing heat in India, right? So taking a global perspective not only asks us to look at things differently as it comes to borders, but also the kind of questions that we ask, which include the questions of environment, right? Global history allows us to do comparative history, and I think that's very, very important. You compare what is happening here with what is happening in Japan, with what is happening in Latin America, in Africa, and so on. It allows space for connected histories, right? We often think of oceans as dividers, right? We have a very land-based thinking and a very border-based thinking, right? But is the ocean a border for Kerala, or has it always been, a connector to something else? And similarly for the Coromandel Coast, I think we have more things to share with Southeast Asia and with East Africa than often we have to share with North India, right? So it allows for connected histories. And it also allows us to look at, how global systems work. Capitalism is not constrained by national frameworks, right? Today, Amazon is the biggest, it's even bigger than different economies, the US economy included, right? So capital does not understand borders. So if we want to understand capital, again, we have to, go beyond borders. And similarly, it also gives us an opportunity to connect the micro to the macro, the local to the global, right? And so it is not necessary that you only look at the meta-narratives, but you look at something very local. I will end now with a very small example, again coming from textile history. What were called as Madras checks, which were produced on the coast of Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, were very integral to the slave trade in crisscrossing Africa and ending up in the Caribbean, right? And these Madras handkerchiefs were worn by slaves and ex-slaves and became an integral part of their identity. So by just following this one piece of cloth, right, across the oceans, you have new perspectives which you never knew existed, right? So the global history opens up very new ways of looking at history. However, I would also like to have a word of caution. Often there are, fads. Somebody says this, and so you have to do global history because that's the fashion, right? I think we need to be true to our sources. We need to start with where we are located. We need to start with the history and with the archives that is in front of us and work from there. It has to be an organic connection. So when, for example, when I worked on my PhD thesis, I was always very irritated when people told me global, look at global. I said, no, I'm not interested in the global. I'm looking at, I'm not even looking at the coast. I'm interested in ordinary kinds of weaving in the Deccan and in the interior areas of Tamil Nadu. That's what I am interested about. So, but once I finished my book, once I finished my research, and then, was mulling over it, then I realized, yes, it is then important to look up and look at the broader scenario, to compare with what is happening in Japan, to compare with what is happening elsewhere, to also see what role did, say, home-based production, the labor of women and men, contribute to the global rise of capitalism, right? So women in China, women in India, women in Europe, how are these histories connected, right? So it is important then to move on to it, but without, without engaging with it as a fad. So I will end. I know people are getting restless. I'm sorry. So thus, as historians, a lot, and as budding historians, a lot rests on your shoulders. How we reconstruct our past, the voices we allow to speak, those that we silence, what we choose to remember and what to forget, shape how we view ourselves in the present and shape the kind of futures we imagine for those who come after us. And therefore, this task needs to be done with a lot of honesty, integrity, care, and reflexivity. How can we write more inclusive, plural histories by at the same time being rigorous, human-centered, and carrying ethical responsibility? I will end here. Thank you very much for giving the opportunity and for listening to me very patiently.